It was New Year's Eve, the kind of night when the air carried a strange electricity, as if the world itself were holding its breath before the stroke of midnight. Paul Temple, the celebrated novelist and part-time detective, adjusted his bow tie in the mirror and tucked a red carnation into his buttonhole. His wife, Steve Sharp, loyal, and forever a steadying force at his side, was already behind the wheel of their new sports car. They were headed for Nicholas Hall, the grand old manor of their friend Sir Stephen Peters, who hosted a legendary New Year's Eve gathering each year. The drive from London to Guildford should have been uneventful, yet Paul's instincts, as always, whispered that danger often arrived uninvited. As the city lights gave way to open country roads, Steve gripped the wheel with her usual mix of skill and nerves. Paul teased her gently about her determined driving, but their laughter was cut short when a set of headlights roared up behind them. A black saloon car, moving with reckless speed, bore down like a predator. "Pull aside, or he'll force us into the hedge," Paul urged. The saloon clipped their car with a sickening scrape of metal before tearing down the road and vanishing into the dark. Steve steadied the car expertly, though her knuckles whitened on the wheel. Paul stepped out to inspect the dented wing when the sound of a siren split the night. A police car screeched to a halt, and, to Paul's surprise, out stepped Chief Inspector Brooks, a thick-set man with a farmer's face but a mind as sharp as any criminal's. "There's been a smash and grab," Brooks explained briskly. "Light fingers, layman, 3,000 pounds worth of diamonds gone, black saloon, dark coat, muffler." That was him. The name alone sent a chill through the air. Light fingers, layman, a lone wolf thief with a reputation for precision and audacity. Had eluded Scotland Yard for years. Paul recalled reports of a bank job in Exeter, of a scar across the back of Layman's left hand, of whispered warnings that he was far more dangerous than his nickname suggested. As the inspector's car roared off in pursuit, Paul and Steve pressed on. Their evening transformed from a simple dinner invitation into a brush with infamy. 10 minutes later, the chase seemed to have gone cold. Police cordons lined the district, but Brooks admitted Layman might already have slipped through. Paul promised to stay alert, and it wasn't long before his vigilance paid off. Headlights caught the silhouette of a car half buried in a ditch off the roadside, the same black saloon. A figure scrambled up the embankment and into their path, a wiry, anxious man with long dark hair, a fresh cut across his cheek, and an overcoat slung oddly over his left arm. He introduced himself as Professor Thompson, an antique dealer bound for Guildford. He claimed the saloon had forced him off the road and that the driver had stolen his own maroon Austin. His story tumbled out in nervous fragments, but Paul noted every detail. Why, on a freezing night, would a man cling to his coat but refuse to wear it? Why recite a suspiciously old registration number for a brand-new car? Still, Paul invited him into their vehicle, outwardly polite but inwardly calculating. The professor, fidgeting, spoke of a rare Queen Elizabeth banknote he was desperate to purchase from a local seller. His voice trembled with urgency. Though not the kind born of academic passion, it was the desperation of someone covering his tracks. At the next crossroads, Paul excused himself to call Sergeant O'Hara, an old ally in Guildford, speaking in low, careful tones. He reported their position and the unexpected passenger. "Is something the matter?" Temple O'Hara asked, his Irish lilt betraying a touch of alarm. Paul's reply was quiet, steady, and absolute yes. "I have the man you're looking for, Lightfingers. Layman is sitting in my car." The trap was sprung. By the time they reached Guildford, Layman's fate was sealed. Arrest came swiftly, though the tension lingered in the winter air, thick as fog. Later, in the candlelit warmth of Nicholas Hall, Paul explained to Steve and Sir Stephen what had given the imposter away, the concealed scar beneath the overcoat. the impossibly outdated car registration, and above all, the impossible claim of a Queen Elizabeth banknote, a thing that had never existed. In the end, Light Fingers had betrayed himself not through force or violence, but through arrogance and invention. But was that truly the end of his story? Or had Paul Temple merely caught one fox, while a far larger hunt was waiting in the shadows of the new year? For most people, New Year's Eve meant champagne toasts, laughter, and music echoing through grand halls. But for Paul Temple, it often meant stepping straight into the shadow of crime. At Nicholas Hall, the party was in full swing. Guests mingled beneath chandeliers, glasses clinked, and the promise of midnight hung thick in the air. Yet even as Steve glowed with warmth among friends, Paul's mind was restless. The capture of Light Fingers Layman should have been cause for celebration. But something about the ease of it unsettled him. Criminals of Layman's cunning did not simply climb into the backseat of their pursuers without resistance. Chief Inspector Brooks arrived late that evening, his jovial face dampened with suspicion. "Temple," he admitted quietly, "there are details here that don't sit right. Layman was clever, no doubt, but why stumble into your path as if begging to be caught? A man like that, he's usually 3 steps ahead," Paul agreed. For every criminal who made headlines, there were countless unknown accomplices, plans yet unfinished, and motives hidden deeper than the public ever suspected. As the party drifted toward midnight, Paul found himself by the library fire, reflecting on the supposed professor's tale of a rare Queen Elizabeth banknote. To most, it had sounded like nonsense. To Paul, it felt like a smokescreen. Why invent such a story? Was Layman buying time, or trying to plant a distraction that pointed elsewhere? He replayed the moment when the man had shielded his left hand with the draped overcoat. The scar had not been visible, but Paul could almost feel its presence beneath the fabric. What else might that hand have held? A weapon. A key. Steve noticed the furrow in her husband's brow. "You've already caught him." "Paul, can't you let it rest?" she asked gently. But Paul shook his head. Criminals like Layman don't act without reason. If he was desperate enough to risk a disguise and spin such a tale, then the necklace from the jewelers may only be one thread of a larger weave. Something bigger may be waiting in the shadows. The stroke of midnight came. The crowd cheered, and champagne corks popped. But even as fireworks scattered across the countryside sky, Paul's thoughts were fixed on the possibility that the night's adventure was not yet over. He was right. 2 days later, news broke that the stolen diamonds had not been recovered. Layman, questioned at length, refused to admit where they were hidden. Brooks reported with frustration that the man laughed at every inquiry, as though holding a private joke. Scotland Yard had secured the criminal, yes, but without the jewels, justice felt hollow. For Paul, it confirmed what he had feared. Layman's arrest had been too neat, too sudden. Determined to probe further, Paul and Steve traveled to Guildford to examine the site where the Black Saloon had been found. The ditch still bore the scars of its crash. Broken branches littered the embankment, and the ground was pitted with fresh footprints. Paul crouched low, running his hand across the soil. "There were at least 2 sets of prints here," he murmured. "One heavier, one lighter." Layman wasn't alone. Steve frowned. Then who was the second? The question hung heavy between them. If Layman had an accomplice, then perhaps the jewels were already far from reach, carried into the night while police attention focused on the false professor. Paul studied the tracks carefully. One print dragged slightly at the heel, as though the person had been injured or carrying something weighty. That was no panicked escape, that was deliberate. At the local constabulary, Paul examined Layman through the bars of his cell. The man's eyes, sharp and calculating, gave away nothing. But when Paul mentioned the missing diamonds, a smirk curved the thief's mouth. £3,000 worth, Lehman drawled, and yet you'll never see a glint of them. They're closer than you think. Temple, perhaps even at your New Year's celebration. The words struck Paul like a cold blade. Was Lehman taunting him, or hinting at something real? Could the jewels already have slipped into Nicholas Hall itself, carried in by an accomplice under cover of festivities? The thought of stolen treasure hidden amid the silver trays and fine wines of Sir Stephen's gathering was almost absurd, yet, in Paul's experience, the most audacious crimes often lurked behind the veil of the ordinary. That night, sleep came reluctantly. Every sound in the house seemed sharper, every creak of timber suspicious. Steve tried to reassure him, but even she could not ignore the peculiar unease that followed them since their roadside encounter. Lehman was behind bars. Yes, but was that really victory, or merely the opening move in a game far larger than anyone realized? Nicholas Hall looked as it always had, grand, timeless, a manor that had survived centuries of storms. Yet as Paul Temple stepped through its doors once more, it felt strangely transformed. Perhaps it was the weight of Lehman's taunt echoing in his mind, the suggestion that stolen jewels could be closer than anyone guessed. Or perhaps it was the subtle tension humming beneath the polite laughter of Sir Stephen's guests. Every smile seemed just a shade too fixed, every toast a little too forced, as if the house itself concealed a secret. Sir Stephen, jovial as ever, welcomed Paul and Steve warmly, yet Paul noticed how the servants carried trays with an odd hesitance, how one footman's eyes lingered too long on Steve's handbag, and how a maid near the library seemed startled when Paul appeared unexpectedly. It might have been nothing, or it might have been everything. The detective's instinct told him that Lehman's reach extended beyond his cell. That night, long after the guests had retired, Paul roamed the silent corridors of Nicholas Hall. The old house breathed with shadows. His footsteps echoed against oak panels, and candlelight revealed faded portraits staring down with solemn judgment. In the library, he found Steve waiting, wrapped in her dressing gown, unable to sleep. "Paul," she whispered, "what if Lehman was right? What if the diamonds are here?" Paul knelt by the fire, poking at the embers as his mind raced. It would explain his confidence, he admitted. He knew we had him, yet he never flinched. He wanted to be caught. Steve, because he knew the real prize was already safe in other hands. The next morning, Chief Inspector Brooks arrived with news that unsettled them all. Lehman had attempted escape during a prison transfer, but had been stopped just short of freedom. He laughed as they dragged him back to his cell. "Tell Temple," he sneered, "that the game's still on." Brooks, frowning, turned to Paul. "Do you think he planted the jewels here?" At Nicholas Hall, Paul didn't answer immediately. Instead, he asked to see the guest list from the night of the party. Names leapt from the page collectors, businessmen, aristocrats, and, tucked among them, a few unfamiliar figures whose presence seemed tenuous at best. One name in particular caught Paul's eye, a Mr. Henry Marlowe, introduced as a London dealer. Steve recalled him vaguely slender, quiet, watchful. He had asked her peculiar questions about their journey, questions that now seemed less like conversation and more like probing for weaknesses. Could Marlowe have been Lehman's accomplice, determined to follow the thread? Paul discreetly searched the guest rooms with Sir Stephen's reluctant blessing. Hours passed, yet nothing emerged until Paul opened a locked trunk in an unused chamber at the far end of the west wing. Inside lay clothing far too fine for a dealer of modest means, and beneath them, a case lined with false compartments, empty compartments. The jewels were not there, but the intent was clear. Returning to the library, Paul found Steve staring out at the frosted gardens. "It's like chasing smoke," she murmured. "Every clue leads to another shadow." Paul placed a hand on her shoulder. "That is how men like Lehman survive. They create layers of deception until even the truth feels like a lie. He paused. But he made one mistake. He tied himself to Nicholas Hall by naming it in his taunt. That tells us the jewels must indeed be here or were here. At the moment he was caught. That evening, Brooks joined Paul and Sir Stephen in the drawing room. Together they laid out the facts the Black Saloon abandoned. The professor's false story. The empty compartments in Marlowe's trunk. Brooks scratched his chin. If Marlowe was the accomplice, where is he now? Paul's expression hardened. Gone, for now, but not far. Men who carry stolen treasure do not run aimlessly. They choose a hiding place. And if Marlowe slipped away during the revelry, he could still be on the grounds. The thought was chilling. The manor, so full of life 2 nights before, suddenly felt like a stage set for danger. Every creak of timber in the stormy night seemed to signal a presence unseen. Steve clutched Paul's hand as they climbed the stairs. "Promise me," she whispered, "that this ends soon." Paul gave a faint smile, though his eyes remained fixed and grim. "It will end, Steve. But the question is, will it end here, under Nicholas Hall's roof, or beyond, where we cannot follow?" As the clock struck midnight once more, Paul knew one truth above all: the diamonds had not vanished into thin air. They were near, perhaps nearer than anyone dared to imagine, and somewhere in the vast, echoing halls of Sir Stephen's manor, a hidden accomplice might even now be smiling in the dark. The storm that swept across Surrey that night rattled the windows of Nicholas Hall and howled through the chimneys like a warning. Paul Temple lay awake, listening, his mind circling the same thought: the jewels were close, somewhere under this roof, within reach yet hidden from sight. Lay the prize that Lightfinger's layman had risked everything for. The question was not just where, but with whom. Unable to bear the stillness, Paul slipped from his room and wandered the corridors with only a lamp for company. The manor's portraits watched him in silence, their painted eyes flickering in the shifting glow. In the gallery, a floorboard creaked, but this time it was not under Paul's feet. He froze, listening. The faintest whisper of movement echoed ahead, deliberate yet cautious. Someone else was prowling the house. He followed the sound down the stairs and toward the library, where the storm's fury was muffled by thick walls. The door was ajar, a blade of lamplight slicing into the hall. Inside, crouched by the fireplace, was the figure of Henry Marlowe. His hands were busy with the carved mantelpiece, probing at the wood as though searching for a hidden compartment. "Marlowe," Paul said calmly, stepping into the room. The man jerked upright, his face pale in the lamplight, eyes sharp with panic. "I think you've been looking for the same thing I have," Paul continued, "only with a very different purpose." Marlowe's hand darted to his coat pocket, but before he could draw, Paul's voice cut like a whip. "Don't! Chief Inspector Brooks is waiting outside that door." It was a bluff. Brooks was asleep in a guest room, but it worked. Marlowe froze, his knuckles whitening as his hand hovered, then slowly retreated. "You don't understand," Marlowe muttered, his composure cracking. "I never touched those diamonds. Layman forced me into this." Paul studied him. "Forced you? Or did he simply find in you a man eager for quick fortune?" Marlowe shook his head, sweat breaking on his brow. "I was his contact, nothing more. He said if I didn't cooperate, he'd ruin me. He was going to stash the necklace here." Just until the heat died down. The admission confirmed Paul's suspicion. Nicholas Hall had been chosen as the hiding place, a bold gamble, placing the jewels in plain sight amid a crowd of revelers. Paul glanced at the mantelpiece. "So where are they?" "Marlowe, you've been searching, but you've found nothing. That's because Layman never trusted you enough to reveal the true hiding place." A sudden crash startled them both. The library door swung wide, and Steve stood framed in the doorway, her eyes flashing. "Paul, someone just tried to slip out through the garden," she exclaimed. "It wasn't Marlowe. He's been here with you. There's another." Another. The word hung like a dagger. Paul turned sharply to Marlowe. Who else was working with Layman? The man stammered, shaking his head furiously. I swear I don't know. He never told me names. But Paul saw the flicker in his eyes, fear, genuine and raw. Whoever the third player was. Marlowe feared them more than he feared capture. Grabbing his coat, Paul rushed with Steve into the storm-lashed gardens. Lantern light barely pierced the rain. But in the distance, a shadow fled across the lawn, heading for the stables. Paul gave chase, Steve at his side. The ground was sodden, each step a battle, but they pressed on until the figure stumbled into the stable yard, cornered by high walls. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the intruder. It was not a guest at all, nor a servant. It was one of the footmen, a quiet, forgettable young man who had blended into the background of Nicholas Hall. His eyes gleamed with defiance as he held up a small velvet-lined case, rain streaming from his hands. "The necklace," Steve whispered, breathless. "Yes," Paul said grimly, advancing. "And I imagine you planned to vanish into the storm with it while suspicion clung to Layman and Marlowe." The footman's jaw tightened. Why should he have it all? I took the risk too. Without me, he'd never have hidden it here. His voice shook between rage and desperation. But I won't rot in a cell for him. I'll keep what's mine. Before Paul could reply, the man lunged toward the stable door. But Brooks, roused by Steve's alarm, emerged from the shadows, pistol drawn. "Not tonight, lad." The inspector barked, trapped. The footman dropped the case into the mud, his shoulders sagging in defeat. Paul picked up the case, opening it to reveal the glitter of 3,000 pounds worth of stolen diamonds, for the first time in days. The tension in his chest eased, the mystery was solved, the accomplice exposed, the jewels recovered, and yet, as the storm eased above them, Paul knew the true mastermind was still behind bars, smiling in his cell, satisfied that his game had stretched so far. Dawn broke slowly over Nicholas Hall, the storm clouds giving way to a pale, tentative light. Inside, the air was heavy with exhaustion, but also with relief. The velvet-lined case sat on the library table, its contents gleaming faintly in the first rays of morning. 3,000 pounds worth of diamonds, dangerous bait that had lured thieves, deceivers, and desperate men into the web Paul Temple had carefully unraveled. Chief Inspector Brooks, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, could not help but grin at the sight. "Well, Temple, I'd say you've done it again. Stolen jewels recovered, accomplices unmasked, and Layman himself behind bars. Scotland Yard will raise a toast in your honor tonight." But Paul shook his head slowly. "We've tied up the threads we can see, yes. But Layman's laughter in his cell still echoes in my mind. He never meant to keep those jewels. He meant them to ensnare. He knew he'd be caught eventually. But his game was to prove that his reach extended further than any prison wall." Steve, seated beside him, looked weary but resolute. "Then what have we really won? Paul, if he still cast shadows from behind bars." Paul reached across and took her hand. "We've won enough to keep the innocent safe for now. That's all any detective can promise." Later that morning, Sir Stephen Peters walked the grounds with Paul, the frost crunching beneath their boots. "You always bring excitement to my New Year's gatherings, Temple," he said with a wry smile. "But tell me, how did you see through it all so quickly?" Paul's answer came with quiet conviction. "Because criminals, no matter how clever, always betray themselves in the smallest of ways." Layman concealed his scar, but in doing so revealed his caution. Marlowe locked his trunk, but left a trail of pretenses in his false compartments. And the footman well. He forgot that invisibility works only until someone decides to look closer. The truth. Sir Stephen is always hiding in plain sight. That night, as Paul and Steve prepared to return home, Brooks stopped them at the drive. "I'll see Layman again tomorrow. Perhaps with the jewels recovered, he'll lose some of that smugness." Paul gave a faint smile. Don't count on it. Inspector, men like Layman don't measure victory in diamonds alone. His triumph is that he forced us all to play his game, and in some sense, by still speaking of him, we let him win a little. The drive back to London was calmer than their storm-lashed nights at Nicholas Hall, but neither Paul nor Steve could entirely shake the tension that lingered. "Do you think we'll hear of him again?" Steve asked, her voice low. Paul kept his eyes on the road. Men like Lightfinger's Layman have a way of leaving echoes. Perhaps we will, perhaps we won't. But rest assured, Steve, when we do, we'll be ready. As the countryside rolled past their windows, the red carnation in Paul's buttonhole caught the morning light. It was a small thing, almost comically bright against the gray of winter, yet it symbolized something enduring, the refusal to let darkness consume entirely. The insistence that reason, courage, and clarity could still stand against deception. For those who had celebrated New Year's Eve at Nicholas Hall, the memory of diamonds glittering in the mud of the stable yard would linger long after the champagne had lost its fizz. For Paul Temple and Steve, it was one more chapter in the endless dance between crime and justice, where every victory was measured not just by what was recovered, but by what was learned. And perhaps that is the true heart of every mystery, not that the jewels are found, nor even that the guilty are caught, but that we, for a moment, glimpse the hidden patterns that bind truth and deceit together. It is a reminder that the smallest clues, the tiniest details, can unravel the grandest illusions. So, if you found yourself drawn into Paul Temple's pursuit of Lightfinger's Layman, remember this the next time you hear a story that feels too neat, too simple. Look again. The truth may be waiting just beneath the surface. If this story intrigued you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done if you had discovered the stolen diamonds under your very roof?